Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about if Europe has a role to play in an era of US-China strategic rivalry. And if you look at the debate on Europe seen from Washington, D.C., it's not very encouraging. There's a lot of negativity in the presentation around Europe, and there's a lot of focus on Europe falling apart. But I would argue that that argument is based often on a misunderstanding about Europe. In the US, there is a bit of a tendency to say that either Europe will end up as a state-like structure or it will fail. But I would argue that Europe has, in the later years, managed to organize itself in a way that actually makes it more efficient in some ways than it has been before. So I would say that the recent challenges that Europe has had to face in the past 10 years with financial crisis, Brexit, migration, has made Europe stronger in the sense of trying to work out a division of labor between the institutions and the states that are members or have affiliations with the EU that enables Europe to perform more as an actor in some areas where it used to not have a footprint. So this comes from the realization from these crises that if Europe is to have influence on a world order that is in flux, as Sanjay described, and where the US and Chinese are competing across a wide range of areas, then Europe has to exercise sovereignty together. They cannot do it separately. They have to perform as more of a coherent actor, even if it's not a unity. In some areas, that's obviously easier than others, because in an area such as trade, the EU has a lot of sovereignty, and there the countries, even the big countries such as France, will operate under a common EU mandate, even if they're in disagreement to some extent with the mandate, as we saw when they discussed their approach to negotiating trade with the US, where France was not happy with the common position, but endorsed that, of course, the EU would negotiate also on behalf of France. There are other areas where the European Union has less influence. One of these areas would be defense and security issues, and especially security and defense far from Europe's home region in the Indo-Pacific. But even here, I would argue that Europe in later years has managed to establish a footprint and is starting to play quite a significant role, mainly as a partner of the US and its allies. The way that works is that the EU can only have very general policy positions with regard to important Indo-Pacific issues, such as the South China Sea and China's advancements, encroachments on international law in that region, or military developments, Belt and Road Initiative that China takes in the Indian Ocean region, and which again sort of pushes out other states. Because there will always be a couple of member states that do not wish to take much action on a given area. So with regard to the South China Sea, the EU has a very general position of supporting international law, on arguing that the states of the region should use peaceful means to settle their conflicts, etc. And that may not sound as much, but what the value of that is that every time the EU negotiates a policy, the member states inform each other of their position on the issue so that you can kind of sort out what is the areas we can agree on where can we not have a common position. And then the EU will allow individual member states to go further by forming groups that can then take action to implement the policy position. And that happens even on security and defense in the Indo-Pacific. So, and these policies that are implemented are then backed up by more general policies of the EU, which have, in the case of the Indo-Pacific, approached various partners to create free trade agreements and security arrangements. So if we, for example, take the Indo-Pacific region, the context is that there is a growing strategic competition between the US and China. It also involves middle powers and smaller powers such as India, Japan, Australia. China has a naval base in the Indo-Pacific in Djibouti, if you count Africa as part of the region. They have a lot of port access around the region, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, that challenges India's position, Western countries' position in the Indian Ocean. And Europe would like to do something about this or form part of a more general effort to counterbalance China and to support some of the countries that they see as partners in maintaining a strong position in the region. So Europe has formed an economic partnership with Japan in December 17, sending a powerful signal against protectionism, but also creating a strategic partnership agreement that facilitates security cooperation and that complements the strong US-Japan security cooperation. The EU also has a long-standing strategic partnership with India, dating back from 2004. That has been revived, and from 2019, the EU has begun discussing common security interests in the Indian Ocean with India. Singapore is also targeted by EU as a key entrance point to ASEAN. Again, there is talk about closer economic and security cooperation from 2018, among other things, concluding a free trade agreement. And the EU also has long-standing cooperation with ASEAN. It has also recently started economic and security cooperation with Australia, and hoping to have a closer relationship with that part of the world as well. So the EU addresses some of the same key states as the US does. There are also differences because Europe sees the Indo-Pacific as strategically linked to Africa, as India does, and to the Middle East. And this is indicated by the fact that the EU has had its first EU-Arab League summit in February 19 in Egypt. That was seen as an opportunity to push back against growing Chinese-Russian influence. And while that in public may not be to the liking of the US, you could argue that in private, this is an organization the US would not address for various issues to do with Israel and other things, but in private, that then lets the European Union deal with a corner of the world where the US can't really do it. So there are some low-hanging fruits in the cooperation between the EU and US, which, could allow them to say that there can be a kind of division of labor in which organizations we address, how far we want to go in counterbalancing China, but we don't necessarily have to be at odds over the main objectives of preserving a free, rules-based, open order, preserving the US alliance system and counterbalancing China. And my experience from this year, from being part of the deployment, the European deployment in the Indo-Pacific, I think shows that while sometimes the rhetoric at the upper strategic levels between Europe and the US is unfriendly, what goes on the ground is very cooperative and demonstrates that the US does actually value Europe as a partner in security and defense in the Indo-Pacific, and that Europe plays a key role because it complements the efforts of the US to draw in Japan, India, and the ASEAN countries around cooperating in a way that sort of constrains some of the policies from China that all these partners do not like. So if we take the example of European operations in the Indo-Pacific, since 2016, a French-led effort has been made to deploy ships, maritime vessels, and airplanes on an annual basis and conduct maritime operations and naval diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific. And it varies from year to year who deploys ships and where these ships go. But this year, in 2019, the main effort was that the French deployed their aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle and sent a carrier group from Toulon in France to Singapore and back. The carrier group sailed from the eastern Mediterranean of the Middle East via the Suez Canal to Bab el-Mandeb, the Horn of Africa, and Yemen. It went across the Indian Ocean and went via the Malacca Strait to Singapore. And one of the eye-opening things, I think, about that trip was how close cooperation was between France and the US. The US was an integrated part of this deployment all the way from Toulon to Singapore. They participated in all the joint exercises France had on the way out. That was with India, it was with Australia, it was with Japan. And while France is reluctant to call this effort counterbalancing of China, it is very clear that they sort of fit into this pearl of states that go from all across the Indo-Pacific and that do cooperate with the United States on pushing back against growing Chinese military presence in the region. It is a French-led effort because France is the indigenous power, or an indigenous power of the Indo-Pacific, because it has quite a lot of territorial possessions there still. And while they may be mainly fairly small island, they give rights to fairly large exclusive economic zones, which means that France has significant maritime, economic, and strategic interests in the region. So, and of course, there is also always an element of national interest in this kind of deployment. So France sells a lot of arms to some of these states, including Egypt and India, and in an effort and deployment like this is an opportunity for them to showcase their fighter jets, their vessels, and sell them to other states. That being said, it is a genuine effort to include other European countries and to try to bring them on board in this effort. So this year there was a rotating cast of allied ships from Portugal, from Denmark, from the UK, from Italy, from Australia as well, and the US that participated, which also demonstrated transatlantic unity concerning the French initiative, and that the US is backing it. What also was clear from the deployment is that in many ways France has replaced the UK as the main defense partner of the US. That was also clear from the Shangri-La dialogue, which was at the end of this deployment. While the UK has assured countries, their partner countries, that they will continue their deployments, there is little trust that it will necessarily happen and that the UK can afford in the long term to keep a sustained defense effort. And that really leaves France in a key position. Ironically, it also matters that France has had a very independent role historically in NATO, where it has developed its own capabilities. So it has a history of being able to operate autonomously, and it can offer a very wide range of capabilities. And that's the kind of partner that the US sees as valuable today, because the US does not want to be called upon every minute when other countries operate. So it wants a partner that it can operate fairly independently from the US. And there, France, ironically, fits the bill very well. So that is one lesson, I think, from this deployment. Another lesson is that it takes time to build up this European force. So sometimes when people talk about it, they'll say, well, they just sent a few ships, they didn't go very far. France was the only country who in reality went east of Goa of all the European countries, so what is it worth? But it takes a long time to build up a kind of force like this. It only started in 2016. And there's also all sorts of problems, such as different deployment cycles between the countries, lack of experience with the environment can matter. It mattered on this deployment, so a lot of exercises had to be rescheduled because they were not used to the environmental conditions in the area. So a period of 10 years, I would think, would be needed to make an assessment of whether the French will end up building a European force. But I think it's a very strong start that they have had. And the fact that there is a sort of group of countries that participate in the deployment means that it will increasingly be seen as a European deployment and not just a French effort. So this year, for example, Denmark sent a frigate, and it went as far as the North Indian Ocean, and it participated in all the exercises with France, and that means that the next time they know each other, they know their different routines, and they can go even further. Another observation from the deployment is that, like I said in the beginning, the US and Europe does not agree on everything, but they can sort of manage to work around that. So the things that the US didn't want to participate in were done on the way back to France instead of on the outgoing trip where the US was part. So for example, exercises with Egypt was done on the way back because they would be controversial for the US at the moment. So in conclusion, I would argue that indeed Europe does have a role to play in Indo-Pacific security and defense, and I think it's an effort that's actually very much valued by the US, and I think it's the kind of division of labor internally in Europe that we'll see more of, where the EU makes some general partnership agreements on the security area and some general statements, and then groups of countries that wishes to take it further will take individual action. So, thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Bart. And I would, of course, like to add my thanks to the Institute for the invitation to speak here today. It's actually my first time in Helsinki, so I'm very, very pleased. Thank you all for coming to join in the panel, and I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion later. How I propose to organize my presentation today is quite simple. I'll first deal with the Indo-Pacific concept, how I view the concept, its advantages or disadvantages, how countries in the region, in this case Southeast Asia, have responded to the Indo-Pacific concept. And in particular, I'll be focusing on ASEAN's response. And I will also then turn to look at the early consequences of adoption of the concept. So first, let me first start off with saying that the Indo-Pacific concept may in fact be seen as a response to rising US-China rivalry, not just on an economic front in the form of Belt and Road, but the strategic front as well. As Bart pointed out earlier, although the Trump administration was the one that breathed new life into the concept, it's not a new one. And Japan, in fact, was the first to recognize that there was a shifting geopolitical landscape when he delivered his Confluence of the Two Seas speech before the Indian Parliament, inviting India to, together with Japan, as democracies to work to ensure freedom and prosperity in the region. So, thus far, the Indo-Pacific concept has had its detractors. A lot of critics say, it's vague, it really amounts to nothing. I'm not one of them. I consider it a useful tool for both analytical and practical reasons. It's useful analytically because, first of all, it highlights the geographic area of concern, as well as the relevant state and institutional actors. There are different views, different countries take different views on the geographic extent of the Indo-Pacific. The US, for instance, considers that it stretches from the west coast of India to the western shores of the United States. Japan stretches it a bit further to include Africa. What is clear, however, is that India becomes a critical node in this concept, and ASEAN retains its relevance, if it doesn't mess up. Second, the Indo-Pacific terminology captures the integral link between the Indian and Pacific Oceans as one strategic theater. Countries like Australia and Japan have long thought about the region in these terms, but it's good to now have greater attention to this. And the third analytical benefit of the Indo-Pacific terminology is that it underscores the growing significance of the maritime domain, where we've seen increasing and at times reckless competition and an undermining of a rules-based order. In June, I testified before the UK House of Commons Defence Committee on the security situation in what the UK is still unfortunately calling the Far East. And I took the position then that the situation in both the East and the South China Seas has worsened, and particularly in the South China Sea, and for reasons I'll be able to explain during Q&A if anyone's interested, I believe that the risk of miscalculation and conflict has heightened even within the last year. As for the tangible or practical implications of adoption of the Indo-Pacific concept, I think that this has practical implications, not least for the balance of power. So adding more players to the mix, like India, dilutes the influence of large powers like China. And insofar as it's a principles-based grouping, Buy into the Indo-Pacific concept actually sends a message that countries apart from the United States are committed to a rules-based order and international law. Ultimately, of course, the credibility of this message will depend on how the Indo-Pacific concept is operationalized. And in this case, I would like to flag the fact that, having a strong economic component is essential. So, what is the Indo-Pacific concept, and is it containment of China? China's objected to the concept on suspicions that it targets it and contains China. But I'd like to argue that a free and open Indo-Pacific benefits China as well as the other countries if only China would take an enlightened view of its interests. China is growing as a maritime power, and freedoms of the seas, overflight, these all help China as a growing maritime power and one that has increasing military as well as economic interests around the globe. So the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think, while it might have been prompted by concerns about China, it does not necessarily need to be a containment strategy. Japan, in fact, has been quite conscious about this and has relabeled its strategy a vision to potentially blunt the hard anti-China edge to it. It's also added greater economic components to it. The ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific takes its cue from Japan and similarly focuses on economics and connectivity. Even the United States, with all the rhetoric against China, has talked about the Indo-Pacific as being inclusive. In the Shangri-La Dialogue in June this year, which is a meeting of defense ministers and other defense officials from the region and beyond, we saw former US Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan refer to the Indo-Pacific vision as inclusive and urging allies and partners to work together to build a regional security network that is inclusive and resilient. So how have countries or institutions like ASEAN responded? There was early buy-in from US allies like Japan and Australia. As mentioned, they've long thought about the region in these terms. European powers like France and the UK were also quick to jump on the bandwagon. Last year in this, both France and the UK adopted Indo-Pacific terminology. Indeed, this year, France launched an Indo-Pacific strategy at the occasion of the Shangri-La Dialogue. The Brits were not too impressed with this one-upmanship, but the rest of us marveled at how at French savoir-faire. I think it was a very effective move to highlight France's contributions to the region. In contrast to these powers, ASEAN and its member states were initially very hesitant about the Indo-Pacific concept, and they were very slow to respond. Only Indonesia had adopted the terminology last year. ASEAN fretted about what the Indo-Pacific concept meant for ASEAN centrality, and it also feared what a fickle Mr. Trump might do how they would position themselves if Mr. Trump changed his mind about the Indo-Pacific concept and it left them exposed to China. I argued in a commentary about a year ago, that ASEAN needs to be more proactive in supporting a rules-based order, as well as initiatives that seek to defend it, including the Indo-Pacific concept. So this June, I was very pleased when I saw that ASEAN had finally bit the bullet and issued an ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. The document itself was not earth-shattering. It was fairly anodyne, and I'm not going through what it stated, but I think what was significant was its adoption of Indo-Pacific terminology, and I think this is positive for three reasons. First, it allows ASEAN to be part of the conversation in shaping the guiding principles of the Indo-Pacific, as well as the means of achieving these principles. Second, it also allows ASEAN to blunt any overtly anti-China instincts. Now, we all want China to behave better, but we don't want this to become about being anti-China. And countries in the region, more than most, I think, are worried about the fallout should this become an anti-China affair. In my view, rather than detracting from ASEAN centrality, buy-in to the Indo-Pacific concept could also help maintain and promote ASEAN centrality. I don't believe that ASEAN has a snowball's hope in hell in the face of coercion and closed seas and trading systems. So a free and open Indo-Pacific is certainly in ASEAN's interests. Now, ultimately, whether buy-in translates into effective security cooperation will depend on whether there's a viable strategy in place. The free and open Indo-Pacific is a vision, it's not a strategy. Even working together with allies and partners is not really a strategy, because the question that's begged is to do what? So I think one thing that I would highlight that needs to be dealt with if we are to achieve a free and open Indo-Pacific is addressing Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, where China has built large artificial islands on disputed features and militarized them. It's also sought to assert controls over the surrounding waters from these disputed features. And this year, it started encroaching once again on coastal states' exclusive economic zones, thereby thumbing its nose at an international tribunal ruling whose main significance was to clarify resource rights. Now, it should be noted that while Beijing insists that the situation in the South China Sea is calm and the region is in harmony, any recent stability, I'm afraid, has largely been a result of smaller countries resigning themselves to a new normal in the South China Sea. The weak states suffer what they must. I think I will go on to highlight what I think is a missing element of the Indo-Pacific strategy at present. We've seen how there were early attempts to resurrect the quadrilateral security dialogue, and I think that wasn't very successful, mainly because I think in this case, India wasn't quite willing to bite. I think Sanjay might deal with that a little bit later, so I won't touch on that. But that might not necessarily be a bad thing, because any formal security grouping might actually put off countries in the region from signing up to the region. So I don't see that as a bad thing. What I do see as missing, though, is the economic component in the Indo-Pacific concept. Now, I think it would be very foolish to think that countries in the region will position themselves in the South China Sea or other issues of US interest or international interest without regard for the wider strategic landscape, including which way the economic winds are blowing. I think the United States shot itself in the foot by withdrawing from the TPP. It's now, since 2018, it now has the BUILD Act, which is meant to facilitate private sector participation in the development of low or middle income economies. But there's been little movement on that front. There's also been little movement on the trilateral partnership for infrastructure investment in the Indo-Pacific between the United States, Japan, and Australia. In short, I think the Indo-Pacific concept is sorely lacking an economic leg, and I think that's going to have consequences for how countries in the region align themselves and decide how to hedge. And I'll stop there, and I could go into deeper detail next, but I would like to offer the floor next to Lise.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman Terve. What a great honor and privilege it is to be here this afternoon, to return to a country which I consider as my second home. 30th visit, let me flag this with a great sense of pride, to Finland, and it's such a great delight to see in the audience some wonderful friends. I'm very grateful to FIIA, I'm very grateful to you, Mr. Chairman, for having thought of me as one possible contributor to this very important dialogue. I would like to dedicate this presentation to someone who helped us a great deal in promoting cooperation between Finland and India in the academic domain, His Excellency, late Benjamin Basin. In fact, I just thought of him on the podium, and I felt like dedicating this presentation to him, because Coming to Finland and talking to him and other colleagues, wonderful colleagues in many parts of Finland, some of whom are sitting here, I developed a very interesting geopolitical perspective on global affairs. One was, of course, that I come from a particular location in global south, that is India, the subcontinent. And coming to Finland always convinced me that being small is not just a matter of size. Small countries can have very big visions, and sometimes very big countries can also have very narrow visions. We have seen it historically, so that's I think it's true. Mr. Chairman, distinguished colleagues on the dais, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, when I was asked to write this draft paper and then make a presentation, I decided to give it a very intriguing title. Let me explain why that title is there in the paper. Geopolitics of Shifting Alliances in the Indo-Pacific, within single quotation marks, in the post-Columbian epoch. It sounds intriguing and perhaps confusing. I'll explain what I mean by that. And then in the subtitle, it is Perspectives from and on India. Now, the reason I decided to focus on this distinction between on and from India was that I think we live in what can be called, George Sorensen, I think, used this term, interregnum. And what that means is that the globe has started spinning after being frozen in the cartography of the Cold War, and I think the foreign policy establishments, academia, people like us, are trying to figure out the meta-geographies of the post-Cold War period. There is a search for new geopolitical templates. There is some kind of a geopolitical vertigo, and if you look at the note for this panel, which I think is brilliantly conceptualized, it draws our attention to the fact that things are in a state of flux. We are looking at globe very differently, and this particular moment in history I call post-Columbian epoch. The reason for that is that I want to take you back in history and geography to 1904, when British geographer Halford J. Mackinder gave that very intriguing address to the Royal Geographical Society, which was published as a research article in Geographical Journal. And he was speaking from a particular location to a particular location. He was talking to the British audience and drawing what he called trying to figure out the broader geographical causation behind history by making the argument that the history of global geopolitics can be divided into three epochs: pre-Columbian, Columbian, and post-Columbian. In the pre-Columbian epoch, it was the land power, the Mongols, Genghis Khan, who struck what he called the Great Asiatic Hammer on the heads of the Europeans, and Europe took to the sea, and that was the Columbian epoch. And in 1904, looking at the Euro-Asian landmass, looking at trans-Siberian railway systems and mapping out the resource potential of Euro-Asia, he said that this is where the geographical pivot of history is. This is a gigantic natural fortress. And there can be possible tenets of this geographical pivot. Russia, he identified as most likely. So, ironically, we all know that during the Cold War, Russians didn't like the word geopolitics, but that has changed. Mackinder was certainly not a very favorite geopolitical thinker, which I think he is very much now. President Putin has also used the word heartland in the digital domain and so on. But he said something in the last paragraph which I think has caught the attention of strategic thinkers today. And that is that he said that ably assisted by Japan, that needs to be qualified in the contemporary context, if China were to use its vast continental resources to build up a maritime fleet, a truly formidable heartland power could be in sight. So I'm sure if Mackinder would have been alive today, probably he would have agreed with the contention that this post-Columbian epoch is far more complex in the sense that if we look at China and we also look at its Belt and Road strategy, then one geopolitical perspective from India is that this is where Mahan and Mackinder are shaking hands. There's a handshake between the sea power and the land power concept. But post-Columbian epoch geostrategy goes beyond this binary of land power and sea power, because international relations today have become far more spatial, multi-spatial international relations. That's one defining feature of contemporary post-Columbian epoch. And then we also find something which probably we did not see that much during the Cold War, and that is the entanglement between geopolitics and geoeconomics. Edward Luttwak has proved to be wrong that geoeconomics has not replaced geopolitics, but we look at entanglement between multiple geographies, economic, political, social, cultural, and so on. So that is one point which I would like to start with, because when we look at perspectives on India and from India, perspectives on India are the perspectives which we see from other capital cities in the world, including Washington, D.C., from the State Department, from Pentagon. And there is this fairly understandable role that is being assigned to India in this period of interregnum in the post-Columbian epoch, where China factor, which I think is a very complex and nuanced factor, looms large. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But I'm talking about China as a factor. China factor is far more nuanced. Secondly, I also want to flag the point that Indo-Pacific is not a new term, as we all know. It was used by German geographer, geopolitician Karl Haushofer when he drew that map of the Pan regions, and one of the Pan regions centered on Japan, which also included India, was described by him as Indo-Pacific. Nicholas J. Spikeman, who talked about rimland, looked at the concept. He also used the term Indo-Pacific, but in the sense of maritime highways. And as we will see a little later, in the Indo-Pacific narratives, maritime security and the security of the sea lanes of communications is a very important emphasis. And then, when Prime Minister Abe came to India, and before that, please also remember that Hillary Clinton also used the word Indo-Pacific, and there was immediate reaction from India. Some very senior diplomats, including Ambassador Shamsar, and also wrote articles in Indian Express. There was an article which acknowledged that yes, Indo-Pacific indeed is now coming up as a strategic continuum, as a very important strategic geography. And I will come to Shangri-La speech of Prime Minister Modi a little later. So when Prime Minister Abe made that speech in the Indian Parliament, he acknowledged that he had taken this concept from Mughal Prince Dara Shekho. And Dara Shekho, who lived from 1615 to 1659, wrote this book called Majma'ul Baharain. And Dara Shekho, who inspired Prime Minister Abe, and he talked about the confluence of the seas, was in fact talking about the interplay between Sufism and Vedanta. So it was in a cultural sense that Prime Minister Abe invited attention to the fact that if we look at beyond the Cold War cartographies on the face of the globe, we see a lot of confluence, we see a lot of interactions, we see a lot of hybridity. So I thought it's very important to be clear on this definitional issue, because, or this conceptual issue, not so much the definitional issue, because as we go from the conceptual to definitional, we see something very interesting. Now let me come to that. And I think that will also, in a way, strengthen my argument that there is indeed a difference between views on India and views from India. I'm not saying they completely diverge, but they also not completely converge. And the reason for that is the definitional aspect of conceptualization, or the concept of Indo-Pacific. If you look at the US definition of Indo-Pacific, it is from the west coast of the United States to India-Pakistan boundary. And the reason for that is that the boundary between the Indo-Pacific Command and the Central Command is the boundary between India and Pakistan. If we look at the Australian understandings of Indo-Pacific, and these are important partners in Quad, then you see that there is an inclination more towards the Bay of Bengal, that is Indonesia, that is more towards the eastern part of the Indian Ocean, which then takes you to the Bay of Bengal. But if you look at the Indian definition of Indo-Pacific, then my reference point is this very important speech that Prime Minister Modi gave, keynote address at the Shangri-La dialogue, where he said that it is from the west coast of the United States to the coast of Africa. So the Indian understanding of Indo-Pacific is this entire region, which means that the term Indo in Indo-Pacific, of course, draws our attention to India and the central location of India, but it also draws our attention to Indian Ocean. And when we talk about Indian Ocean, and that's a very important point in my view, because when India looks at the Indo-Pacific, India, given its central location in Indian Ocean, is looking at it from the point of view of Greater Indian Ocean. And that nuance, in my view, is extremely important, because I will later on make an argument, and I'll conclude with that argument, let me not disclose that, where I would argue that by understanding these nuances and differences, we can build up a much better architecture of cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. Another point which I would like to make is that there is another way of looking at Indo-Pacific and India's role in it, and that is, if we look at Indo-Pacific in regional terms, we are looking at a super region of sub-regions. Because we know that the notion of Indo-Pacific as a region has been critiqued by a lot of scholars and intellectuals and even policymakers who find this diversity of Indo-Pacific absolutely mind-boggling. As a matter of fact, we are reminded, and that's an important perspective from India, we are reminded by a number of scholars and academics in India, which perhaps includes myself as well, that Indo-Pacific, when Prime Minister Modi calls it a natural region in his keynote address, he is also making a very important point, because Indo-Pacific is an eco-geographical region. So some of our early references on to Indo-Pacific we find in the books on fisheries, we find it in books which are talking about the integrity of the ecosystems and so on. And the reason I want to flag this point is that one of the key features of the post-Columbian epoch, besides being the fact that international relations have become very multispatial, is that we are looking at the revival and return of these classical geopolitical theories in a contemporary context, which is also being very rightly called the Anthropocene. We must not forget that Indo-Pacific is also a region of subregions. Many of these subregions, say for example Bay of Bengal and South China Sea, are very vulnerable to the challenge of climate change. We should also not forget that this super region of subregions has subregions like South Asia, which is one of the most natural disaster-prone regions on the face of the globe. The reason I want to flag this is because later on I'm going to argue that when you talk about Quad, and you talk about the rationale for reviving the Quad, and you talk about an inclusive Indo-Pacific, you talk about an Indo-Pacific where we build a new architecture of cooperation and understanding, then some of the building blocks of this new architecture of cooperation have to be based on the realization that some of the great challenges to human security, food security, livelihood security in the Indo-Pacific realm come from climate change, global warming, natural disasters. So these are some very, very important concepts that we have to keep in mind as we reimagine or talk about the new Indo-Pacific, where Quad has a very important role to play, but, and that is important qualification in my view, that in the new Indo-Pacific, to use again Prime Minister Modi's phrase, new Indo-Pacific, we also have to realize that small states in the Indo-Pacific region, including island states, have a very important role to play. There's no doubt that in today's world, when we talk about multiple geographies and multiple perspectives, there are strategic perspectives. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And that brings me then to another important point which I want to flag, and that is that in order to understand the challenge of Indo-Pacific, we also have to understand that different institutions within the states, within the Quad members, can have very different understandings of Indo-Pacific. So, Ministry of Defense in India, Pentagon are likely to have probably greater convergence on the traditional threats to security in the Indo-Pacific. It is understandable. But if we look at the State Department and Ministries of External Affairs of these countries, and then we move from there to Ministry of Trade and Commerce, I think the Indo-Pacific concept is likely to become more nuanced. And it's very important to capture that nuance, because as my colleague rightly pointed out, that one of the challenges that we face is, as we realize the importance of this super region, that it is yet to be operationalized and even institutionalized. Now, if that is the case, then I would submit that probably what we need in the Indo-Pacific is what Professor Oren Young, who has been, I think he is very well known here, who has been working on regime theory and on the Arctic issues, has called a regime complex. And in order to build up that regime complex, I think Quad countries, particularly India and the United States, given the fact that there is a broadening and deepening of their geopolitical relationship between these two countries, which, by the way, were called estranged democracies during the Cold War. And somehow I believe that even though there is this narrative of containing China, that one of the key objectives or purposes behind the Indo-Pacific and the Quad is to contain China, I think there's a growing realization even among the strategic communities that in contemporary world, unlike the Cold War period, when you have such an entanglement between geoeconomics and geopolitics, China happens to be the second largest trading partner of India. It is not possible to contain or counterbalance China in the sense in which this vocabulary, including balance of power, was being understood during the Cold War. Now, this is again not to suggest that there is no competition, there's no rivalry between these countries. I think that would be very naive to say that there. But then it is not necessary that all domains of competition will necessarily turn into all domains of rivalry. So I think that is also a very important qualification that we need to bear in mind. And then I would like to sort of conclude my presentation, and then of course I'll be very happy to take questions, is that just to quote a few passages from Prime Minister Modi's keynote address in Singapore. I think one of the great highlights of that keynote address was the fact that he talked about the centrality of ASEAN. And ASEAN becomes central to the Indo-Pacific vision of India. How much centrality does United States of America give to ASEAN is something which I think is open to discussion. But from India's point of view, the strategic geographies of India's expanding sphere of influence, or sphere of interest, let me say, would acknowledge the centrality of ASEAN. Now, there is another question which I think is sometimes raised. Which came first? Was it Indo-Pacific that came first before India's look east and act east, or the other way around? I think it is important to acknowledge that India's acknowledgement of the strategic significance of the super region called Indo-Pacific is not something that India woke up one day with that realization. We have to take a historical perspective, and first historical perspective, of course, is I can take you back to these ancient times of the Cholas when India had this maritime connectivity with countries of Southeast Asia and beyond. Even historically, India-China relations can be seen in that perspective. Secondly, we all know that how India's foreign policy remained a prisoner of Cold War cartography, because we did not look beyond Andaman Seas during the Cold War. India's extended neighborhood stopped there. As India's economy has grown over the years, one of the fastest growing economies in the country, it is absolutely not surprising that India has started looking beyond the Andaman Sea. In fact, started saying that India is very much a littoral state of the Straits of Malacca. And then also given the fact that China's interests and activities in the Indian Ocean have grown, and that of course has been seen with some concern in New Delhi, you find this shift from India's look east to act east. Now, the strategic geographies to act east are provided by Indo-Pacific. And this is where partnerships, I'm slightly wary of using the word alliances here, but strategic partnerships with the countries of the Quad and other countries, smaller powers in the region, becomes extremely important from India's point of view. Prime Minister Modi said, I quote, India does not see the Indo-Pacific region as a strategy or as a club of limited members, unquote. I quote him again, it stands for free, open, and inclusive region, which embraces us in common pursuits of progress and prosperity. It includes all nations in its geography, as also others beyond who might have a stake in it, unquote. And then he said, I quote, not as a grouping that seeks to dominate, and by no means do we consider it as directed against any country, unquote. And then he says, I quote, Southeast Asia is at the center, and ASEAN has been and will be central to its future, unquote. I think it's an address which is full of vision, but then we all know that the journeys from vision to action and implementation is indeed a very important journey. Now, this journey I don't think India can undertake on its own or by its own, and this is where partnerships with Europe, with European Union, become extremely important. Because if Indo-Pacific is the super region with its sub-regions, then I think every part of the world, right from the Arctic to Antarctica, has a stake in political stability, human security issues, environmental security, climate change issues in this vast region called the Indo-Pacific. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I would say that my work is a work in progress, so is perhaps Indo-Pacific. There is this absolute urgency, I would say, to think how best can this concept be operationalized and institutionalized. I don't think there can be one single institution. Maybe what Oren Young says could be useful, which is identifying different issue areas, which falls within India's so-called new non-alignment policy of multiple engagements, depending upon the issue area under consideration. It will be useful to identify several building blocks, which of course will include the safety and security at sea, security of the sea lanes of communications, which might even invite collaboration with organizations like IMO. And then let us not forget that we have Indian Ocean Rim Association. Indian Ocean region also has its own challenges. United States is a dialogue partner, so is China, so is Japan. So I think there are parallel initiatives, despite the fact there is a divergence of interest, despite the fact that there are elements of rivalry, it is indeed possible to move in the direction of institutionalizing Indo-Pacific. And you will agree with me that in this direction, each and every country, and even the countries which are not a part of this region, will have a very important role to play. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much.
First, I want to thank the Institute for the invitation to participate in this dialogue and to offer some thoughts on the Trump administration's policy toward the Indo-Pacific region. Second, an important disclaimer or two. The first is that what you will hear today are my views alone. They do not represent the views or policies of the National Defense University, the Department of Defense, that's my paymaster, the Department of State, or the US government in toto. Second disclaimer is that I am not a psychiatrist, I am not a psychologist, nor am I a psyche. So it's kind of beyond my powers to discuss or explain the mindset of the president, to divine the meaning of his statements and tweets, or how his policy management style has affected perceptions of US policy. But I am very interested in your thoughts in the matter. So let me begin my brief remarks to try and put my larger paper, the United States Alliances and Security Strategy in an Uncertain Era, into a broader context. So where to begin? As a former member of the policy planning staff at the Department of State, I think I would start with the definition of US interests, because the definition of interests is the starting point for strategy and for policy. Drawing on decades of policy history, I believe the United States' interests toward the Indo-Pacific region can be ordered along 5 lines, five objectives. The first being the defense of the homeland, US territories, and US citizens from attacks or threats originating in the region. The second being the maintenance of an open, rules-based international order to include support for the resolution of disputes through peaceful means in opposition to coercion or the use of force. Third, access to the region and freedom of navigation, opposition to any power or group of powers that would seek to deny US access to the region or to threaten US interests. Fourth, the strengthening of US alliance relationships. And fifth, the maintenance of a balance of power that supports regional stability and promotes economic prosperity. Now, central to the realization of US interests is the concept of access. Assuring access to the markets of Asia for American commerce that goes back in policy history to the opening of Japan and the open door notes. Over the past century, the United States, in pursuit of these objectives, has adopted multiple strategic frameworks to advance its interests. The open door, back in the early 1900s, was initially a unilateral initiative aimed at protecting US commercial interests in China that subsequently evolved into a multilateral framework for both managing commercial competition and preserving China's administrative and territorial integrity. Later, Theodore Roosevelt played balance of power politics, aligning the United States with Japan to check Russia's efforts to establish a sphere of influence in northern China and Korea. In 1920, at the Washington Conference, the United States worked to fashion a multilateral framework for naval arms limitation, to preserve China's territorial integrity, and to stabilize the post-war status quo in the Pacific. And from 1945 onward, the United States has relied on a series of bilateral alliances to protect and advance its interests. Today, the Indo-Pacific strategy is the latest in a series of post-Cold War policy documents that speak to the continuing importance of the alliance structure in the Indo-Pacific region. The document reaffirms the centrality of the alliance structure. It refers to it as our unique network of allies and partners. In doing so, it reflects the US commitment to the bilateral alliances that have been, in essence, the building blocks of US strategy, regional security strategies, for close to 70 years. And today, the Indo-Pacific strategy is nested in the Trump administration's national security strategy and national defense strategies. The documents define the Indo-Pacific as an arena of geopolitical competition and find China a revisionist power aiming to challenge American power, influence, and interests, attempting to erode American security and prosperity, and engaging in a military buildup aimed to limit U.S. access to the region and provide China a free hand there. And again, I emphasize the importance of the concept of access in terms of development of U.S. strategy. I think that's critical. So this brings us to China, the U.S.-China relationship, which has, I think, clearly entered a new era. Back in the summer of 1991, as the Cold War was winding down, I spent about a week in Tokyo speaking with Japanese economists, trying to get an understanding of the direction of economics in the Asia-Pacific region. At Keidanren, at Keizai Doyukai, both Japanese business organizations, the economists had run the numbers. This is the early 1990s, and were anticipating that China would surpass Japan as the world's second largest economy sometime in the first decade of the 21st century. They were unanimous in their conclusion that managing the rise of China would be Japan's defining strategic challenge through 2050. That's proven true for the United States and across the globe as well, I believe. I think now, in terms of the U.S.-China relationship, the bipartisan consensus that guided what I believe was a partnership-oriented China policy from the Nixon opening through the visions of China as a responsible stakeholder, the Bob Zoellick vision, that has eroded. That no longer exists. The vision of the WTO China, economic opening and reform with a promise down the road of some form of political liberalization. This was a vision shared by Democrats and Republicans alike. That has proven to be an illusion. Under President Xi, China is in fact moving backwards, away from the 2013 Party Congress commitment to allow the market to play a decisive role in the allocation of resources. It's just going the opposite way now. So today, there's a new U.S.-China relationship that's in the process of being defined. And it will be one in which I think decades of U.S. preeminence, which we have enjoyed in the Asia-Pacific region, will be challenged, and in particular, our alliance structure. I think from a U.S. policy perspective, we should anticipate that China will take every opportunity to attenuate the alliance structure, as it has. For example, in 2017, the THAAD deployment in Korea, and the recent overflight with Russia over the Liancourt Rocks in the East China Sea, also known as Takashima or Dokdo. At the same time, however, the alliance structure under the Trump administration has only continued to strengthen and evolve. My larger paper addresses the individual alliances, and we can talk about judgments on each. The point I want to make here is that the bilateral alliance structure has not been static. Over the past decade or so, the alliance structure has been evolving from the Cold War hub and spokes model toward a more comprehensive and networked architecture that includes increased cooperation between U.S. alliance partners and active efforts to engage non-allies in the building of strategic partnerships. This network structure is now a central element of the Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, I think Bart referred to this, a legitimate question is whether this dynamic, this evolution of the alliance structure, represents a natural development or is in reality a form of hedging by U.S. allies to manage risks either from an increasingly assertive China or from the Trump administration's America First management of alliance policy, or both. And here again, I'm interested in your views and perspectives on this matter. But what is clear and has been recognized by China in its 2019 Defense White Paper is that the U.S. alliances in the Indo-Pacific region are being strengthened. I think a tribute to the deep state alliance managers in Washington and across the region. In effect, the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think, is making a bet that by strengthening alliances and strategic partnerships, by developing bilateral alliance-based security and economic cooperation with Japan, Australia, and the ROK, and I think we've taken a hit in terms of the Japan-ROK relationship, that by supporting ASEAN centrality, by developing U.S.-India relations and exploring the potential for the Quad, the strategy, I think, aims to create freestanding but potentially interlocking policy building blocks that will support a balance of power or a countervailing dynamic aimed at advancing the values of the United States, its allies, and strategic partners. The strategy is making a bet that our values can prevail if we invest and marshal the economic, diplomatic, and military resources to support an open, rules-based international order. And clearly here, there's a lot to be done. Let me conclude here and wait for your questions. Thank you.